Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutword.com. I am Vinay Kaushi and our guest today is Angela Thurman. Angela, if I understand this correctly, you are the Principal Managing Director at Thurman Co. And really your story begins with acquiring an electrical engineering degree before you went off to work for the likes of NASA and Collins Aerospace, which then of course led you to start your own company. But what is perhaps of interest, or at least caught my attention, I'm sure it would be of interest to the listeners as well, is the fact that you help companies based on three key experiences: program management and contract management. And my understanding of Thurman Co. is that you help companies build and execute on complex program plans that solve their needs, often with the support of third-party suppliers as well. But you're really analyzing contractual coverage gaps and helping negotiate deals and almost being a coach with some of these deals on the basis of your experience. So would that be accurate, or did I get that in a good nutshell, so to speak?
That was very good. Yes. I can tell that you've looked at my website and probably my LinkedIn profile. So yes, our services are three-pronged. I usually describe us as a program management consulting firm, but we do also offer contract management and supplier management services because those are wrapped up in project management as a whole. But we do want to let companies know that we can specialize in that area as well, because I personally have some expertise in that field and want to be able to make those services available.
I'm curious, Angela, was there a particular incident or event that got you thinking that you need to start your own company in order to help businesses?
So yes, I had spent 10 years at Collins Aerospace, and unfortunately at the end of 2020, given the landscape, I was released from my position. I was in a good spot being here in Houston. We have a very complex and diverse market space. And I had some time to look around, and I decided I've worked from home for 6 years. I really enjoy my non-commute, and I want to continue to work from home. And with my own background, being a project management professional, a PMP, and the fact that I have an engineering degree, a master's degree in telecommunications management, this rich history in supplier management due to my role at Collins and in other companies, it just made me think I want to start my own company. And by virtue of the network, an extensive network that I have, because of my years in the industry, I had some good contacts as well. And so that definitely helped start me on that path.
Mm. You've gained quite a valuable set of experiences and skills along the way. But what would you say is your personal area of strength?
My devotion to the practice of project management, I would say, because early in my career, I had the distinction, the
Mhm.
opportunity of being trained in project management by Dr. Harold Kersner while I was at NASA, because he taught at a local university, and NASA actually brought him in to conduct project management training.
Mhm.
I feel like I had a unique opportunity to get that training from the horse's mouth, if you will. And so I feel like throughout my 30-year career, I've been doing project management regardless of what my title
Mhm.
was. And I feel like I was taught how to do the real rigor of project management from the very beginning. I didn't develop bad habits.
Mhm.
And I was taught this is the reason why you have to do this and that from the beginning. And now I'm in a position where I can help pass some of those lessons learned on to others and mentor others. And I really enjoy that part of my my position now.
In that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
Risk management. I think risk management is probably a big gap. And I think everyone maybe gives lip service to it, but they don't have well-structured and documented processes around risk management. And therefore, they're at risk and may not even realize it. And they certainly don't have good mitigation processes in place.
If I'm hearing you correctly, and if I understand this correctly, companies go into projects because of the outcome that they so wish to achieve. But while they may be diving headlong down that journey, there are, of course, risks that are associated with it. You're suggesting that it's almost, you, as a project manager, you need to weigh up the pros and the cons and make sure that the cons are significantly reduced by actually making plans for it.
Yes. So I used to work at a company where we had something that we called the boiled frog report. Are you aware of that analogy?
No, I'm not.
So if you put a frog in a pot of water, he's happy and content to just stay there. And if you slowly turn up the temperature, he's still happy and content to stay in that pot. And eventually, you can turn the temperature up so high that you can boil the frog to death. And he's unaware of his circumstances. He's unaware of the environment and the risk that he is in, that he's facing. He's going to boil to death and he's unaware. So we had a log of those long-term risks that right now it's not that much of a risk, but if we don't do anything about it, it can become a catastrophe.
Okay.
So that was our boiled frog report.
That sounds really interesting. I'm curious, how would you go about putting that log together? Do you sit there and brainstorm about all the things that could potentially go wrong? Is that how it works?
Things that, let's say, here in my home, I've got a little sapling that has started to grow up near the foundation of my home. Today, it's not that much of a risk. It's just a little sapling. And this weekend, I could go and pull that little sapling out with my bare hands. 5 years from now, it could be a fairly good sized little tree. 10 years from now, it could be causing significant damage to the foundation of my home. So that could be on my boiled frog report. And at some point, I want to do something about it. So do I go out this weekend and pull that little sapling out of the ground? Or 10 years from now, do I have to pay a structural engineer to come and do, damage repair to the foundation of my home after I've removed a giant tree?
Risk is certainly a big part of it. And I would say a lot of risk also comes with the fact that there is often change that evolves during the course of a project as well. Given your experiences, how do you deal with that? Because it has enormous ramifications to suppliers, contracts, etc. Could you help us distill this huge issue into bite-sized pieces?
So I would say that the foremost thing to do is to have a change register, some sort of document. Maybe you're using Jira to document all of your changes. Maybe you're just using a spreadsheet. The tool itself is not as important as the diligence and the practice of documenting the changes. And you may have to track whether this particular change is included. Is it a scope change? Or is it merely some sort of modification to the path you were taking? So if it is a scope change, who needs to be informed? Who needs to be responsible to ensure that the contract is updated, pricing is considered, if it's a sort of change where some sort of regulatory requirements have to be considered, certification of parts has to be considered, all of those sorts of things, because coming from an aerospace background, that's what I'm immediately going to think of. Am I going to have to change my certification test plan and all of that sort of thing? You have to think about, what does this little change, how does that ripple down?
Mm-hmm.
So documenting all of those changes and considering who else is going to be impacted by that change. So working with your team, your project team, to make sure that everything is covered. But the main thing is just being in that practice of documenting each and every change, because if you forget something, then it will certainly pop up its head later on, and you'll say, oh, I forgot that one, and now we have to go back and rework a whole bunch of stuff, and that adds time to your schedule, costs, and it could be a significant impact to the project later.
Mm-hmm. How often would you say we need to revisit this log or register? Is this something that's done on a daily basis, or
at least weekly? Let's say that you're having some weekly cadence meeting with your project team. That needs to be just a regular part of your weekly cadence.
Mm-hmm. And from what I'm hearing, obviously, it's not just the dedication of putting things down, but also being able to communicate with all concerned parties.
Yeah.
When we say communication, most people tend to gloss over it because everybody communicates. We
yes,
talk, we
yes.
email, etc., use Slack or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But there's more to it, in that quite often things still fall through the cracks. Mm-hmm. Given your experiences, how would you speak to such folks who have probably been noticing a few things going amiss, and it's popped up on their radar, but they're not too concerned about it. But at the back of their mind, they're going, if things don't change somewhat in the near future, this could be quite a mountain instead of a molehill.
So hopefully somewhere in all of the documentation that you've started with your project, you've got a project charter, mm-hmm. You've got a stakeholders register, and one of the formal documents that a really good project manager will have is a project management plan. And so this is part of the project management body of knowledge. The PMBOK will say is a best practice. So part of your project management plan is to have a plan for communication. So what sorts of communication to the team, to your stakeholders, to outside parties do you plan to have? Are you going to have minutes from your weekly or biweekly, whatever the cadence is, for the cadence meetings, or project, I'm trying to think of another word for cadence, status meetings? Mm-hmm. Are you going to have a monthly PowerPoint presentation to the stakeholders? Where are your various registers? So your risk register, your change log or register, your action item register, where are those going to reside? Who can access them? Who has authority to edit them? Those sorts of things. Where are those all going to be archived? Mm-hmm. And that should be a part of your communication plan. And then you would also include the sort of daily ad hoc communications like Slack or email and those sorts of things that just pop up during the day.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, it's not just about the tools, it's not just about identifying who needs to be informed and the processes that need to take place in order to communicate and communicate well. There is almost a thought process of building for your team, almost starting a new company within a company
Yes.
sort of mentality.
Yes.
And I'm curious as to how you factor in things like the diversity in culture and backgrounds, especially as you communicate, because you probably had these experiences. Somebody says something in maybe Slack, for example, and it can often be interpreted very differently to the way it was intended. So how do we educate team members to create that degree of transparency in our communication, and even being able to just select the right type of medium, because some conversations are best had face to face as opposed to sending a message via Slack, even though many in the tech industry would prefer to send messages via one medium and one medium alone.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a very good topic, because we have so many characteristics that we need to keep in mind, because it's not just our geographic diversity. We've got cultural diversity. We've got age diversity, because I work with people who weren't even born when I began my career. And so, yeah, they're texting me messages, and I'm like, this really needed to be in an email, because I need to archive what you've said. And yes, I can archive a text message, but those additional steps are just added work. And that is an education process. And so getting that kind of agreement from the team of these will be our methods of communication, given the priority of the message, the urgency behind the message, because there are some things that if I need to know this or that, I don't want to get it in an email. I want you to pick up the phone and call me, because this is something I urgently need to know now. Don't rely on the fact that when I finished 3 hours of meetings, I'm going to check my email. Yeah, that's something that the team needs to agree on, and that it should be included in your communication plan.
Would you say that you almost need to create the right culture at the start of a project?
Yes. So that is something that you can do at the project kickoff meeting, and then you can continue to support early on. And that is something that is probably a very difficult thing for the project manager to instill at the beginning, because the project manager doesn't have any formal authority typically, because the project manager is assigned these resources for the duration of the project, but they're not. Let's say you've got an engineering resource and you've got a quality resource on your team. You're not usually that person's direct manager. You're not doing their annual reviews. You don't have the authority to give them a raise generally, but you're hopefully using your skills and your influence to get them to want to do their best and to perform well for the project and support the team.
You raised an interesting point, because in such circumstances, and I've had a couple of these issues as well, wherein you've been given a directive and an outcome to achieve, but it's not necessarily your team members' objective. They still have to do their regular work,
the real job,
and those tasks, because they're direct manager, get priority over everything else, which means your project gets delayed. Now, how do you deal with that in order to still push through, apart from trying to do everything yourself?
Yes. So that is when it's very important to ensure that the managers of your team members understand what the purpose of the project is, what the goals, what is it that we're trying to achieve, that they understand the charter of this team. Why have we convened this team and undertaken this project? So who is your project sponsor? And So if it's the VP of some organization or it's the director of some organization, they are going to be your champion. And it's not that I just personally wanted to do this, but I was directed by my project sponsor, my champion, and they have given me the resources and the authority to convene this team, and these are the goals, and this is why. So we're either going to improve quality, we're going to launch a new product that is going to yield all of this additional revenue, or there's some reason, some goal. And it's important that everyone, all of your stakeholders, understand what that goal is and they agree to support the project.
Again, if I understand this correctly, you're suggesting that we almost sit down with all concerned stakeholders, direct and indirect, and ensure that there is a common understanding of the outcome, and that the right sorts of KRs or KPIs, if you will, have been set in their individual portfolio, so to speak, so that the project can get some traction in the medium to long term. Yeah.
The project sponsor signs the charter, and that is saying, I agree. This is the purpose of the project. This is the goal. These are the KPIs. This is the schedule, and I'm sponsoring this. This is my name. I'm the champion, and I agree. This is what we intend to do.
We talked about the boiled frog report. I'm curious, when you talk about documentation and processes, I'm assuming that you've developed templates at the very least to speed up a lot of this thinking. How does that work? Or are there specific templates that you use in order to manage change within a project?
Yes, so that's a very good point. Because I am a member of PMI, there are a number of templates that are available to me by virtue of my membership. A lot of those I have just directly downloaded, and then I've tweaked them a bit to give them my own flair. There are other templates, and because risk is just a personal area of interest, and just I really like risk management a lot. I've developed a risk management template. I also developed a risk advisory report. So this is a report that a project manager would send out to the people with a legitimate need to know about a risk. And it has an ISO chart on it. So you gauge the risk at the current state. And then if nothing is done to mitigate that risk, maybe in a few days or a few weeks, you might update that risk report to say, okay, nothing was done. You didn't give me the authority to do anything. So now the risk has changed. It's gotten better. It's gotten worse. And the same thing is true. We shouldn't always just focus on risk. There's also the flip side, which is opportunities. So in our projects, we also have the possibility of capturing opportunity. It could be that if we assign more resources to this project for this period or for this task, we could bring the schedule in, and that would yield these results. So by virtue of spending a little more money, assigning a few more people, we could beat our competitor to market, and then this would happen, and that's an opportunity. And so we actually do talk about risks and opportunities. And so, yeah, I have a template for that as well: risk advisory and risk and opportunity management.
You're almost advising on risk on a continual basis, as you do with opportunity. With this, how do you factor in things like, for example, the recent supply chain issues we're facing, which seems to have a little light at the end of the tunnel? Is that something you just got to factor in, and it means blowing out your timelines, or is there something else that we could do in such circumstances?
Because I come from supply chain, for me, what's happening now is not recent. and there are things that you can do to monitor your supply chain risk. Yeah, that's what you would do. You would just have a constant view of where your risks are. And supply chain is always one of those risks.
Mm-hmm. How do you factor in these costs? Because for a lot of companies, from what I'm hearing, there are additional costs given the issues that they're facing. How do you make that decision, or is it even made within the project management scope, about the final product and the costs associated with it? Is it something that the company absorbs? Is it something that we pass on to customers? How does all of that factor into this whole conversation?
So that's one of the reasons why my company exists, is because many small to medium-sized organizations don't have full-time employees for these roles.
Yeah.
For project management, it is an overhead cost. And so as a consulting company, we will come in, and because projects are by definition temporary, we will come in on a temporary basis to assist those organizations with our expertise, knowing that this is a temporary position. So that's one solution. Another solution is that many organizations have what is called a project management office, staffed with project managers that will work for different divisions of the organization at different times. So one year, you may be on a project that supports the marketing organization. And the next year, you may be on a project that supports the engineering division. So because project management is industry agnostic, there is that flexibility to move around. And that is very helpful. In very large organizations, there are project managers within a business unit. So it could be within the engineering division. They'll have an organization of project managers dedicated to engineering, or project managers dedicated to facilities management. But that's typical of rather large organizations, like 10,000 employees or more.
Just going back to the question, it's really on a case-by-case basis that you determine the implication of costs, for example, on a project.
Yeah. So the costs, let's say we're speaking about the supply chain sort of costs. So the project management it's an overhead cost, but the project manager is going to be looking to all of those costs being rolled into the budget for that project. And yes, let's say you find out that the costs of shipping a project or shipping a product from Brazil to New York City has gone up 25% in the last 3 years. And I'm just making those numbers up. Then yes, your organization has to begin to factor that into the ultimate sales price, not only for the production, but the ultimate sales price of your product. And so the project manager has to be able to gather current information and roll that in to their pricing model.
I'm also curious, are there any other things that we should be aware of, both from a communication point of view, as well as a project success point of view, that we need to keep on our radar in order to ensure a good outcome in the long run?
I think one thing that we haven't talked about yet is capturing lessons learned. So throughout the course of the project, another register, if you will, or an archive, is to capture all of the lessons learned. Now, this isn't just a mistake, but either you recognized a way to do something better, or you recognized that the old way we've always done it didn't work, and so we've made a process improvement, or one of your team members just had a eureka moment, and you need to capture that. And however it is that you communicate that within your organization so that you're not constantly reinventing the wheel is very helpful. Not very many organizations have been able to capitalize on that. And if your team can capitalize on lessons learned, you'll really put yourself head and shoulders above the rest.
I can. That sounds like a valuable point. I can see the value in that. What about the idea of creating checks and balances? Because it's one thing for perhaps a person or a few individuals to initiate one part of the project. How do we make sure that it's being done correctly? And I'm just thinking of an analogy that happened a while ago, wherein a bridge was asked to be constructed across the river. Construction began on both ends. Obviously, I planned this out. But as they came towards the middle, they found there was a 3-foot gap between the two sides. Obviously, someone didn't check to see whether the starting point on one end was done the right way, which created chaos in the long run. How do we prevent those sorts of scenarios?
Oh, that's a good one. That particular one, I think just engineering drawing peer reviews would be very important, and making sure that peer review is always really important to make sure you haven't missed anything. And that's a form of checks and balances within an engineering perspective. Another thing is being an engineer myself, I can spoof on them a little bit, but we always have that tendency for marketing to want to let's just get it to market. Let's just get it to market as fast as possible. And then engineering will be, let's make it as the best possible. Let's make everything just the best possible. So we call that gold plating. The engineers want everything to be just gold plated. And somewhere there has to be that happy medium where it's the best quality we can make it and still get it to market. It's usually up to the project manager to try and find where that happy medium lies. And a lot of times the quality team is definitely going to be involved in helping establish what some of those checks and balances are going to be. But we always talk about how if you've got cost, schedule, and requirements, you can usually have the best. If you try to improve, if you speed up the schedule, then you're not going to have the best quality or the best price. You can't have the best quality and the fastest schedule, or you can't have the best price and the best quality. So that's why it's a triangle. And so you're going to try and balance the triangle.
Certainly.
So, yeah.
I'm also curious, as I'm aware of a project, and I won't name the organization behind it, where a rollout for a particular cloud-based program, customized, of course, to their particular needs, has been delayed by close to 2 years. And the current leaders of this particular project seem to believe that to get it out the door as quickly as possible, the best solution would be to throw bodies at the problem. And it may make a lot of sense. The more engineers and developers you can put on a seat and get them to work, probably you'll get a solution. But in my mind, there's something very wrong about doing that. It might solve some issues. It might look good on paper, but not necessarily lead to an outcome. How do you balance that, the pressures of we need results versus ensuring the successful rollout of something that's usable, and most of all, creating that remark-worthy experience that the users and people that the product is intended for really need and want?
When I look at a project schedule and and I'm looking at all the dependencies and all of the items that help build the critical path for the schedule, frequently it's not going to be affected by simply adding more resources, more hours, more bodies to the schedule, because those dependencies are still in place. And unless I can resolve the conflict in the schedule, just throwing more bodies isn't going to help.
Yeah.
I have to be able to solve the conflict in the schedule. So is it that there's a problem with the way a microchip is programmed and I don't know how to fix that? Is it some sort of production issue, maybe with building that microchip? Am I not getting the utility that I need? Throwing more programmers on the software is not going to solve my problem. You have to look at what are the real root causes and try and solve those problems. Asking people to work longer hours and assigning more people isn't always the solution, and it's certainly not always the best solution. Sometimes you actually do need more people, but you run into the problem of, at this point in the project, say we're halfway down the project, finding people that have the right skills that are available to come on board the project, and then training them up to the level that they need to be to contribute to the project. By the time we do all that, we're 3 or 4 more months down the road. And then there's not enough time left in the schedule to actually recover. You really have to think about whether or not just adding more people to the project is going to be of any benefit.
Would the scenarios that we've just talked about, would they have been dealt with appropriately had we started with a document or a register, as you put it, from the project get-go?
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. Because if you had put on your risk register that the possibility of X, Y, and Z happening, and maybe even the probability of that risk occurring might be fairly low, but you at least had it on your register that it was a risk, it was identified and might be monitored, because you would have identified, let's identify a mitigation step just in case we do encounter that. You would have at least been thinking about it.
Okay. When it comes to mitigation steps, is that another brainstorming session, just going through all the risk items and coming up with
mitigation steps? That's really brainstorming, because you don't really restrict yourself on anything. It can be the wildest, craziest things, and that you might never really enact, but it's very free flowing, and then you actually would record the things that you could enact. But yeah, you don't restrict yourself when you're trying to think of what could I do to prevent this or to correct this risk if it were to occur. Yes.
At the start of our conversation, you referred to the fact that you had learned project management from pretty much the horse's mouth, and that it helped you not make mistakes that you would have otherwise perhaps have picked up along the way. Would you say that for most organizations, a safe bet would be to hire someone with a PMI certification?
I would recommend it, because that way, that number one, they have a certain amount of training. And number two, they have a certain amount of documented project management experience, because you have to have both of those to even sit for the exam.
I'm assuming, though, that mistakes can still be picked up simply because of who you've got or your bosses, etc. Is there a way to mitigate the risks of project managers speak?
Sure. Hopefully, if in my experience, there are lots and lots of people who have the title of project manager and yet do not understand what project management is, because we're very quick to apply that title if someone has this or that type of job responsibility. But a project manager should have a certain set of core skills. You should be able to understand and build requirements. You should be able to understand and build a schedule. And you should understand how the budget and the schedule are linked. You should be able to identify the critical path in your schedule, so that these are the things that absolutely impact the completion of this project. Other things are on the periphery, but these things directly impact the completion of this project. And so that's why working with someone who has a PMI certification will help assure you that the person you're dealing with has that core skill set. Hopefully, if someone is really interested in project management as a career choice, they're a member of PMI, they're active in their local chapter, they're continuing to keep because a PMI member has to complete a certain amount of, or PMP rather, PMP has to continually keep their skills updated. And you would want to deal with someone who is doing that, taking additional training, giving back to their community through their skills, mentoring others. I would hope.
In talking about communication, we've talked about how you would communicate to your team and set the right culture and mindset. But communication also involves more than that. And I'm thinking of the rest of the organization, who may not have, which I say, a window seat into all that's going on within the project itself, and may not necessarily be interested in such things. As a project manager, you've, however, got to keep that visibility and awareness going within the organization. I was going to suggest that you're almost required to build a narrative of your journey and perhaps of the overall success of the project. What does that entail, and what does that look like?
So I've been in the position where once a month you get one slide that goes to the top management or the board of directors, or depending on the organization's size, you maybe have one slide that goes to your CEO's monthly update from your division, something like that. And in that case, it has to be very succinct. It's probably going to be very visual, because a picture says more than 1,000 words. So you're probably going to use some sort of graphic. And it has to convey the current status, but you don't want to misrepresent any kind of risks, or you don't want to be overly optimistic. So if the project is going along fine, that's great. But if there's a problem, you don't want to cover it up. You definitely don't want to do that, because that could be a career limiting move. I would say you want to present the information as plainly, concisely as you can in a visual way.
I'm sure the listeners, at least a few listeners, going, what the risk mitigation in terms of project planning sounds like a good thing to do. Now, like most ideas, it would probably be at the back of one's head and not necessarily implemented. To create or to help with that bit of urgency in trying to put this together, could you share an example of perhaps a particular circumstance where, if a particular risk was not addressed, there would have been a potential cost that you're aware of to the organization?
In my previous career, I was responsible for a product line where the supplier notified me that in a year, a little more than a year, in fact, a particular product was going to be made obsolete. They simply were no longer going to manufacture that product any longer. And I not only had a customer who was currently purchasing that product, but another customer who was in the process of certifying their aircraft to include that product. So the second customer's aircraft was not yet in commercial production, but their plan did include this particular product in the flight deck. Number one, I needed to notify both customers that this product was not going to be available any longer. Number two, get an alternative product, which the supplier did provide a drop-in replacement, which was wonderful, that they suggested would be suitable. And then work with both customers to transition to the replacement product. So the risks that we were facing were that these customers, one was in Japan, one was in China, and if their authorization, we have the FAA, they both have authorities that approve the airworthiness of their products. If they did not work with their authorities to get these products certified for flight on those aircraft in time before we ran out of the product that we had that had been manufactured by the end of the run out type period, basically, we would have aircraft without the product. And that would be a bad thing. Or in the case of the second customer, they would not be able to certify their aircraft in time to meet their launch date. So that was the risk. And I worked very carefully with the team, with the team that marketing, basically, that spoke directly to the customer, with the vendor. And for a year, we did everything from buying additional products before manufacturing shut down. We monitored it very carefully. We had to do a lot of additional testing. We had to do all of the publication updates. We even had to buy, different support type products. But it required very careful monitoring to make sure that we hit all our milestones so that we didn't run out before the new product was approved. And so that was a very heavy risk, a very big risk we were facing with a lot of ramifications. And because so many entities were involved, that made it even more complex. But ultimately, we had great success, but it was because of the very careful monitoring with bi-weekly meetings involving all the parties. But it could have just blown up in our face if no one had paid attention to this one email that came through, or had not paid attention to all the little details that were required.
I'm assuming that at least in one of those clients' cases, it could have potentially cost tens of millions of dollars.
Oh, yes. If you can't sell an airplane because it's missing, there's a hole in the cockpit. That's millions of dollars.
I guess my next question is, does it help to associate a figure with each risk of the potential cost? Yes. That definitely helps. Because that helps people to, whether they do it consciously or subconsciously, it helps them to understand the urgency of this. Okay. I know this is a huge topic and we could spend hours talking about it, but we have covered some ground. But Angela, would you say that there is perhaps an aspect or more that often doesn't quite stay on people's radar, but should? If so, what would they be?
Again, I think I will go to supply chain and supply chain risk. And I think that too often, I think that that's certainly more on people's minds now than it was, say, 3 years ago. But I think that we tend to want to believe we can just place our orders and things will come. And we don't often realize how changes at our suppliers can affect our products. And in highly regulated industries like aerospace, automotive, pharma, that can be very important. Anything where you have to be able to have traceability of the parts or products, lot sizes or lot content, serial numbers, having that supplier or vendor traceability is really important, and having their participation and having knowledge of changes at your suppliers is critical. And if you're not asking the right questions, you certainly aren't getting any answers, because they're not going to volunteer this information.
Terrific. Angela, to wrap things up, if you were listening to this episode, what would be your top takeaway?
If I were listening to this episode, I would say risk and more risk and communicate.
And Angela, if listeners are curious and wanted to find out more and connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Either LinkedIn or my website, which is www.thurmanco.com.
Excellent. And we'll put a link for that in the show notes. Angela, this has been very insightful. Thank you so much for doing this.